Okay, welcome everybody. I always love doing these webinars because I get to see and welcome people from all over the world. And I think you're in for a particular treat today. We've got Jane McTighe joining us. And before we begin, I just want to give you a little bit of information about Triumph Learning. We are a supplemental and test prep publisher. We publish books, and we also have an online product called Coach Digital or Readiness. And as a gift today for attending, we're going to give you a 15% discount on our Performance Coach book. We also urge you to join the Assessment for Learning community. By joining, you get the benefit of being able to access all of our previous webinars, the recordings, and you can still get your CEU credits by taking a short quiz. So to get your CE certificate for your CE units, you will get an email tomorrow before the end of the day from EdWeb. So be looking for that in your email. Now, I don't think I need to tell you a lot about Jay. You probably already know quite a bit, but I don't know if you do know that Jay has been an educator himself, both on the state level, not both, but on the state level, the district level, and the building level. He's also the author of many books, including Understanding by Design with Grant Wiggins. And I think I will leave it there and let Jay tell you the rest. I'm turning it over to you, Jay.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon if you're in the afternoon time zone. But I also know there are some people here for whom it is good morning, and a few people down in Australia for which this is the middle of the night. So good day or good night to you. Welcome to everyone. I'm going to give you an overview of this session and get right into it. A little bit of background about my, I guess, reason for being featured on the webinar. I've had a long history in my career of working with performance tasks, including work at the state level in Maryland, where during the 90s, the state of Maryland developed statewide performance assessments. The only format we had on our state assessments for 9 years were performance-based assessments. We had no multiple choice items on our state tests. We learned a tremendous about the design and use of performance assessments in a large-scale testing situation. But for me, as important was the impact that those performance tasks had on teaching and learning. And my own 2 children went through Maryland schools during that era, and I saw the impact on what they were learning, what assignments they were doing, what homework they were doing, and so forth. And it helped me appreciate the fact that good, rich performance tasks are much more than just something you do at the end of teaching to get a grade. They become a focus and purpose for teaching, and they give relevance and meaning to students for their learning. I then transitioned to directing something called the Maryland Assessment Consortium, which was a state-level project in which teachers from all around the state of Maryland came together in summer workshops to design performance tasks and associated rubrics tied to, at the time, Maryland state standards. The performance tasks were not summative assessments, however. They were meant to be rich learning activities and formative assessments. So again, I learned a lot about the design and use of performance tasks. Along the way, I've written 4 books that feature emphasis on performance assessment. And then, as some of you know, and as Adrian mentioned, I co-authored the Understanding by Design series with Grant Wiggins. So I give you this background only to say I feel eminently prepared and qualified to share with you some ideas around design and use of performance tasks. So let's look at the outline of our webinar for the next 48 minutes. I want to address a couple of key topics. The question, why use performance tasks? And I suspect you of an appreciation for this because you signed up for this webinar. I want to take a look at the characteristics or features of effective performance tasks, some ideas for designing authentic tasks, and then share some useful resources with you. So that's a look at the overview of the content that I will present. In terms of process, I'm going to insert periodically during our time together something that I call a pause. I'm going to time it for about 2 minutes, and the pause will give you an opportunity, if you're viewing this with other people, to summarize what for you are key points, add your own thoughts. How does this idea or this example relate to your work, or what ideas come to mind? And if there are questions that come up from something I say or some of the examples, you could bring your question up to others in your group and discuss. If you're viewing the webinar by yourself, take the 2-minute pause as an opportunity to reflect on the ideas you just heard, but also if you have comments or questions, you can record those in the chat box. And I will do my best to respond to questions, either during the flow of the webinar, if that seems appropriate, or I'll reserve some time at the end to address questions that have come in. All right? I have a little bell which I will use. Hopefully you can hear that from where you're located. When you hear the bell, it's a signal just to wrap up conversations that you might be having with others during these periodic pauses. All right? And we'll use the pause several times during this webinar. So let me jump right into the first question. So what is a performance task? I take a straightforward definition on the screen and on your handout, I believe you have. To me, a performance task is any learning activity or assessment that asks students to actually perform with their knowledge. They're asked to apply their knowledge in some context with some purpose. Performance tasks typically yield a tangible product. It may be written, it may be visual, it may be multimedia or technology-based, and or a tangible performance. It could be oral, it could be kinesthetic, etc. So it's producing something. Performance tasks can be simply rich learning experiences, and or they can be used for assessment. We can assess what students do, in other words. So often people think of performance assessment tasks only, and my contention is we should think about performance tasks more broadly. They can be used as assessments. They can also be used as a focus of rich learning activities. And I think the best task can do both. So why use performance tasks? There are probably a lot of reasons we could cite, but I'm going to highlight 2. The first is, it's my contention that we need authentic performance tasks in order to focus on the most important learning outcomes of schooling, outcomes that are embedded both within academic standards and also those outcomes that cut across subject or discipline areas, such as 21st century skills or habits of mind. Second purpose is the tasks, I believe, have the potential to support meaningful, engaged, and ultimately enduring learning. So I want to focus my remarks and examples in this webinar on those 2 purposes. So let me begin by looking at outcomes of value. I'm going to start by looking at some within academic subject areas. These are driven largely by standards, be they national standards in the US like Common Core, or state or provincial standards such as the new British Columbia curriculum, or Australia national curriculum, for example. So when we look at standards or outcomes in academic areas, my recommendation is don't fixate too narrowly on grade level standards only, because the grade level standards are often very specific and often discrete, and there can be lots of them. What I encourage teachers and curriculum teams to do is to step back and look at the bigger picture, look at the opening pages of standards documents. In fact, I propose do a close reading, if you will, of the opening pages. Go in with a highlighter and highlight what the opening pages say are the goals of the standards in the long term. Why are we teaching these things? What do we want students to be able to do in the long run? And those goals or outcomes are often stated very overtly in the opening pages. I propose that that's what we want to keep as a focus. The grade level standards are often more specific, and they might be seen as the building blocks toward longer performances. But we want to keep the end in mind, in other words. So let's look at just a few examples and think about these goals or outcomes as the focus for designing performance tasks in various grades. So on the screen is one, fairly straightforward. We want students to be able to write for various purposes, different genres, and for different audiences and situations. Now you might say, well, yeah, that's a goal. It's a broad goal. And my response is, as it should be. It's a long-term goal for writing. It's like an anchor standard, if you're familiar with the Common Core standards. But if we plan backward from this particular writing goal, it suggests to me that at every grade level, even down into the primary grades, we want to have opportunities for kids to write, to inform, to explain, create an argument, to persuade. And as they get older, maybe more sophisticated genre, like satire or informational guides or technical manuals. For examples of two long-term goals in mathematics. These are derived from standards. We want students to be able to address messy problems in math. You know what I mean by that? A messy problem is not one in which you often see in math textbooks, where if you've memorized the algorithm and plug in the right numbers, you get an answer. That's really not a problem. That's at best an exercise. A problem, by definition, is something you don't know what to do when you're initially confronted with it. That calls for mathematical reasoning, use of strategies, checking to see if your answer is reasonable, and indeed, it involves the disposition or habit of perseverance, because good problem solvers keep at it when they're struggling with a messy problem. They don't give up right away. If we were to say, as part of a school district mathematics curriculum, that we want students to get better at problem solving in this way, it suggests that we build performance tasks that are messy, that are real world like, and that involve reasoning and persistence. And then we teach kids how to do these with the math they're learning at each level. Here's an example of performance goals for history and social studies. You find these statements at the beginning of history and social studies standards, but they are sometimes misunderstood or maybe not even recognized when we get into the grade level standards that tend to focus on more specific content about historical periods. This is not to say that historical content is unimportant. It is to say or suggest that we're going to teach content of history through the lens of these larger ideas, looking at patterns of history and how they play out at the present, critically appraising historical claims as two examples. And so having goals like this suggests rich performance task possibilities. To summarize, every subject has such long-term goals. They are performance-based in that they specify what we want students to be able to do. And they become a focal point for the creation of or the selection of rich performance tasks. My reading of the standards, modern standards from various sources, tell me quite overtly that this is what the standards are calling for in virtually every discipline. Those of you who are familiar with the next generation science standards in the US, you've read the opening pages, an excerpt is on the screen. You know that this is what they're saying. The message of NGSS is we want to be teaching toward conceptual understanding of cross-cutting concepts and core ideas. We want to be embracing the science practices of having kids doing science, not just learning facts about science. So this confluence of content based around conceptually big ideas and process or practices suggests a matrix model where we look at teaching, not just marching through a body of factual knowledge, but engaging kids in coming to understand and apply the practices of science. And it's that intersection of content and practice, if you will, that form the basis for rich performance tasks. In addition to outcomes in traditional subject areas, we have outcomes that cut across disciplines. On the screen is an interesting graphic, and if you haven't seen this, you can go online and just Google NGSS commonalities. This was put together by folks at NSTA, National Science Teachers Association, where they looked at the big outcomes from 3 disciplines: Common Core English Language Arts, Common Core Mathematics, and NGSS Science. And you can see in the center of the overlapping ovals where common outcomes reside. Now, even if you're not using Common Core or Next Generation Standards, it doesn't matter, because my experience is the opening pages of your standards are likely to have many of the same points. So you can see in the middle here, M3, 4, S7, the capacity to develop, support, and critique arguments grounded in evidence is an interdisciplinary outcome. Of course, how scientists engage in argument is not identical to how historians do, but the idea of building and supporting argument with evidence is a commonality. Therefore, if we want to honor what the standards are telling us, we should see regularly opportunities for kids to do performance tasks involving argumentation. Another category of outcomes might be nested under the umbrella of so-called 21st century skills. People often refer to the 4 C's: critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication as examples of such transdisciplinary skills. As an old guy and having been around for a long time, I chuckle when I hear the term 21st century skills. I started teaching in the 70s, and I had colleagues, and myself included, who were trying to teach toward these 4 C's. So I don't think they're new. But I do agree that in an era where we can Google much of the world's information on a smartphone, it makes sense to target outcomes like these, even more importantly than ever before. So if you think about 21st century skills, these themselves are long-term performance goals. Therefore, as we build performance tasks to help develop and deepen these capacities and to assess them, we want to ensure that one or more of these C's are included. Those of you who have looked at some of the research that's been done around employer needs, and one that's on the screen is actually the results of a national survey that's done with both employers, both large businesses and small, as well as people in higher ed, where they've articulated the skill set that they are looking for in employees. When you look at the listing, including the priority, you see these cross-disciplinary 21st century skill types being highlighted. So once again, we want to think about creating performance tasks that give us evidence of these capacities that are growing across the grades and students, as well as tasks that will help students develop and practice these capabilities. By showing you this slide, I want to go on the record as not trying to make the case that the only purpose of school is preparing kids for jobs. I certainly don't believe that. I think there are many important outcomes of schooling that transcend just job preparation. But I do agree, and as the parent of two 20-somethings who've seen many of their friends not be employable in at least the fields of their choosing because they didn't have the sufficient skill set. I do believe that preparing for these kinds of skills is important, albeit certainly not the only purpose for schooling. So I'd like to take a pause now and give you a chance just to think about what you've heard or jot down questions or discuss with your group mates. What do you think about what I've discussed thus far? The idea that the important outcomes of schooling within subject areas, as well as some that cut across subject areas, are really performance-based outcomes and therefore need to be the focus for performance tasks. So, 2-minute pause. So I'm going to interrupt your cogitations or conversations and take a look at this next chunk. What are the characteristics of rich performance tasks? Let's look at several. Maybe unnecessary, but worth nonetheless pointing out that a performance task calls for performance. More generally, these tasks require students to apply their learning. Here is an example of an application task that involves a science investigation for upper elementary grade students. In this task, students are asked to apply their understanding of scientific methodology, at least at a basic level, to conducting, planning, in this case, an investigation. And you could have them just plan the investigation if you were using this as an assessment to see if they understood aspects like control of variables, or to make it more authentic, you could actually do this task and actually conduct the investigation. But my point here is that performance tasks are application oriented. You have to do something with your learning, not just give back what you've learned. Second characteristic, good performance tasks are open-ended, implying that they typically don't have a, quote, single correct answer. Or there are some tasks that have a good, reasonable answer, but there's not a single way of going about the task. So they may be open-ended both in outcome and or in process. Here's an example of a performance task built for the study of a state in the US, although it could be a state in Australia or South Africa or a province in Canada or the study of a region or a country. So have a look. Hopefully you can see that this is an open-ended task. There's not a single correct answer. There's not a single tour that one might plan. In fact, part of the intent is for students to have to think about the key historic, geographical, economic, and cultural aspect of their state or their region, and decide what are the most important, and then to think about the sequence of the itinerary, and notice that the task is more than just drawing lines through a map. You have to explain why you've chosen your particular sites and the logic behind your itinerary. Now, I'd like you to think about this also as not simply something we would do at the end of a study of a state or a province or a country or a region, but think about this as being presented to students right in the beginning. So as they're learning about Pennsylvania or New South Wales or Manitoba, they are thinking about their tour. And I propose that having a worthy performance task that comes at the end, in fact, helps students learn, remember, synthesize, and make sense of some of the particulars along the way. Third characteristic, important to me, and I suspect many of you, we want to create tasks that are interesting, that are relevant for students. And we do that by presenting a context that's authentic, that reflects what people do outside of school, and also that's novel in the sense that it's not just a task that they've done before 10 times and it's just kind of formulaic or rote. It requires thinking because you're confronted with something different. There's a context for the task. This leads me to show you the visual that's now on the screen. This visual can be thought of from assessment or instructional point of view. But the outer ring is reflecting assessments. If we look at all of the assessment types that teachers use, we have a whole range of formats and types. We have tests that might be given at the end of a unit or the end of a course. We have quizzes that are shorter in scope that we might use along the way. We have skill checks to check on or assess the developing proficiency of skills, including basic skills. We have observations that would be used in subjects like physical education, primary grades. The teachers are great kid watchers. And these assessments are used to gather information about learning. A subset of all the assessments that we use are performance tasks. Performance tasks involve application and yield typically a product or a performance. But think about it. A performance task could be dribbling a basketball in PE or tying your shoe in first grade or kindergarten. It could involve diagramming a sentence in fifth grade. My point is not all performances are necessarily authentic. They may be subsets of authentic performance. Like dribbling a basketball is not the same as playing the game. In the inner oval is a smaller set of tasks that are truly authentic. They're set in an authentic, realistic context. They have constraints of the sort that people outside of school face, time limits, budget constraints. They're working for a particular audience, etc. And my belief is that the best tasks are not only authentic, not only involve application, but they call for transfer of learning and thus can be used to assess understanding. Say it another way, how do we know students really understand the content they're learning? Well, to me, the best evidence of understanding is when students can apply their learning to a new situation, in an authentic situation, where they have to adapt and adjust to fit the context. That, to me, is the best measure of understanding, and therefore is a rich assessment of understanding via application. Now, the proportions in the graphic are also meant to suggest that we don't necessarily do authentic performance tasks all the time. There are other assessment types that are used, and there are other purposes involved as well. But I am suggesting that we want to work toward authentic performance tasks as a subset of all the assessments we use, or more generally, all the learning activities we use. Here's another example of a performance task in mathematics, tied to the content of area and perimeter. So the task presents students with an authentic, real-life situation in which area and perimeter is used. Having authentic tasks also helps teachers answer a question that you often hear from students, especially as they go up the grades. Why do we have to learn this stuff? Whoever uses this. Framing the content you teach around authentic tasks should help answer that question. In fact, the task should reveal how people outside of school apply the things we're learning. The motivational aspect, in other words, often for kids. Fourth characteristic, alluded to a moment ago, is something I want to make more overt. Performance tasks give us evidence not only of basic skills or basic knowledge, but the ability to transfer your learning, and thus give evidence of understanding. Think about it. Rote learning will only enable a student to give back what was told them in the way it was told. If you really want to see if they understand the content, have them apply it in the context of an authentic situation and explain it. And that will give us evidence of true understanding, not just surface knowledge. Here's a short but very interesting high school mathematics task tied to a unit on statistics with a focus on measures of central tendency, mean, median, and mode. Notice the clever task that this teacher designed. I love this example. And the teacher who gave it to me told me that when he announced this, that he would allow the students to choose their method for grade calculation for that marking period. Their interest in learning mean, median, mode went way up. So that's another aspect of authenticity. Trying to create tasks that are not only authentic to how people outside of school use knowledge and skills, that sort of real world authenticity, but authentic to the interests and experiences of students. Best tasks are inherently interesting to them, and they want to work on the task because, in this case, it's in their interest. So let me wrap up this segment before a pause by suggesting an analogy. Think about the authentic tasks as like the game in athletics or the play in theater. The game is authentic. You have to put everything together that you worked on in practice. Knowledge of the game, the individual skills of playing the game, and also understandings, otherwise known as strategy. You have to put all that together on the field or on the court or on the ice. The game is an authentic performance. It involves transfer, right? In that every game is different. How the other team lines up may be different than what we practiced, and the team has to adjust. The coach can't come out and play for you. It has to be done by the players. If you think about authentic performance tasks as the game we want kids to be able to play with knowledge, skills, and understanding, we can then plan backward from the game to, in fact, develop our practices. Practices are the equivalent of lessons in teaching. And in our lessons, we're going to have the game in mind, but given the kids we have, or the players on our team, we're going to determine what will they need to know to play the game well, what skills do we have to develop, and what strategies are important to good performance. This gives us the context for teaching some of the basics and some of the particulars. But 2 points I want to make with this analogy before pausing. First is, while the game requires basics, knowledge, skills, and understanding, just developing those in isolation is insufficient, as every coach will tell you. Coach does something else to prepare kids for the game, and that's often known as a scrimmage. What is a scrimmage? A scrimmage is a simulation of the game or game conditions in practice. The difference is that the coach gives feedback to the team and the players. So think of the scrimmage as the best formative assessment to prepare for the authentic performance that's coming ahead of the game. I think too often teachers think if they cover all the basic skills and they've had kids learn the rules, they're ready for the game. But if they've never been on the field or been on the court and never played the full game, they've only worked on the component parts, they're not going to be fully prepared. Then the second and last point for the moment, before a pause, is the idea that in coaching, coach doesn't feel that his or her job is to cover the playbook play by play. They don't think that way. They think about the performances in the game, what they want their players to do well. They assess where their team is and where individuals are, and they plan their practices backward from what they need to do to improve game performance. To say it another way, having authentic performance in mind and always in sight, I believe, helps teachers prioritize and focus their teaching in a way that's qualitatively different from the teacher who thinks, oh, I have to go through the playbook play by play. I've got to cover all these grade level standards in the order in which they're listed. That's not our job. Our job is coaching for performance around outcomes that matter. So on that note, let's take another pause. What do you think of the ideas just heard? Okay, welcome back. I'm going to restart. I'm scanning the comments and questions, and one question came in I'd like to address right now, which is question, should performance tasks come at the end of every unit? In my ideal world, I say yes. Any major unit, other than maybe very introductory, I believe should have at least one performance task included. I agree that in general the task would come at or toward the end of the unit, but I also would highlight the practice of presenting the task early in the unit, if not the first day, so kids know what they're going to be working toward, because I think this gives them purpose and focus, and it provides the teacher an opportunity, like the coach, to say, now remember what's coming. You're going to need to know this or develop a skill in order to be successful or effective. I also think that having performance tests at the end of every unit provides the potential to have a portfolio, if you will, of evidence of students' ability to apply their knowledge. My late colleague and best friend, Grant Wiggins, had a lovely aphorism. He said, students should graduate from school with a resume of accomplishment, not simply a transcript of courses taken and a GPA. I always love that. But the question becomes, what would be in a student portfolio of accomplishment? To me, a large part of what would be evidence of their accomplishments would be their performance on rich, authentic tasks. However, if you're starting out, you haven't done much with performance tasks yet, it can be challenging to design and implement and score these, so don't kill yourself. If you haven't done much of this before, I wouldn't try to have a performance task for every single unit you teach. I would think big, but start small. Start with 1, 2, or 3, and get comfortable with it, get your students comfortable with the idea, and then you can evolve over time. So thanks for your question. All right, so I'm going to take a look now at the question, how do we design authentic and engaging performance tasks? And I have some very specific ideas to share. First of these is drawn from the work that Grant Wiggins and I have done over the years with Understanding by Design, or UBD. We have a fairly elaborate theory of what understanding is and how to assess for it. Because our time is limited, I'm going to give you a short but practical answer to the question, what do we look for as evidence of understanding? Simply put, we propose that when students can do two things, when they can apply their learning to something new, some situation, ideally an authentic context, and in conjunction with applying their learning, they can explain it. The verb sets that you see on the screen are examples of the kind of verbs we would have in the performance task, and they would involve these kinds of thinking. So we're going to have a task that involves creating a solution to a problem, critiquing a flawed experimental design, making a prediction, solving a problem, raising new questions for inquiry, and so forth. On the explanation side, we're going to ask students as part of the performance task to explain a concept, use an analogy to illustrate, teach an idea to somebody else, like a younger child, or through a museum display. We're going to ask them to justify their answer, not just give an answer, and so forth. If you think about it, We're talking about a simplified version of a doctoral dissertation, because in the dissertation, doctoral students have to do more than just identify a research question, do their research, and write their thesis or their paper. They have to defend it. It's a dissertation and its defense that shows that you really understand what you've investigated. So in a less sophisticated and complex form, we're going to ask students to apply and explain. If you have performance tasks that don't involve these two dimensions, I'm suggesting that it may not be worth the time or effort. Second consideration in performance tasks is to ensure that students are involved with sophisticated, in-depth thinking. And to that end, the depth of knowledge frame or scale has proven to be a useful design tool. Now, I suspect many of you viewers right now are familiar with DOK, or depth of knowledge, but perhaps not everyone. So let me briefly just give a summary. There's much information online. You can Google depth of knowledge and you'll get a good tutorial. In essence, Dr. Norman Webb developed a 4-level taxonomy, if you will, of the cognitive complexity of tasks or assignments or learning activities. So let me just briefly run through the 4 levels. Level 1, as you can see on the screen, involves the student basically in recalling information or performing a very simple skill, like a 1-step skill. You don't need much understanding to do level 1 tasks, and they're not the focus of performance tasks in my judgment. Level 2 involve a little bit more mental process or operation. For instance, in mathematics, it might be a 2-step problem, but it's pretty straightforward, and if you know the algorithm and plug in the right numbers, you'll get the answer. In reading it, for example, it would be just getting the gist of a text. You know, this text is about X, not any inference or interpretation called for. When we get to level 3, however, we're starting to get in more deeper levels of thinking. This is where we involve some strategy, some reasoning. In reading, it involves inference, interpretation. In mathematics, it involves reasoning through more complex problems that aren't simple or require more than plug-in. Level 3 tasks also require explanation, support, justification, as noted a moment ago. Level 4 tasks are much more sophisticated. These tend to be long-term in nature. These are very open-ended, authentic, and often there are a number of constraints. So these are the very difficult longer-term tasks. Those of you familiar with project-based learning, I propose that good projects are often at level 4 of depth of knowledge. These may not be practical for every teacher who's got a large body of content to cover and or working with younger kids that don't have the capacities for these long-term in-depth projects. So my rule of thumb is when you're creating a performance task, in general, you should be focusing on level 3. Take a moment once again to look at the characteristics here. These are what I believe should be embodied. So depth of knowledge is a useful framework, and you can use it in part to look at existing performance tasks that you may be using or may be on the internet, and really make sure that they are at least at level 3. Otherwise, the juice ain't worth the squeeze. You can put a lot of time into performance tasks, but what they're addressing is essentially low-level content or even rote learning, and to me, that's not worth the effort. So another idea I want to share with you around task design is the use of what I call task frames, and I'll give you a great resource in a moment. But have a look at the example on the screen. This is a task frame associated with information or expository writing. But you'll notice it's a particular genre type of writing to teach someone how to do something. So it's a task frame in that you could plug in the particulars. So let me show you an example from an elementary classroom. Oops. Actually, here's a simplified version of that informative writing frame. This task frame was used by teachers in an elementary school, and this is a little first grader who has developed a how-to guide in the form of a picture book on something that he likes to do and knows how to do, which is breakdancing. In the interest of our schedule, I'm not going to show the video, but he is showing his book, step-by-step guide to breakdancing, and then he does an actual demonstration of the task or of the skill. So that's an example of a task frame. Now let's go back to the frame. Can you envision a version of this for, say, 5th or 6th graders? One example I've seen is a 5th grader developed a tutorial guide for his grandmother to use FaceTime with him because she doesn't live in his city. Can you fast forward and think about a more sophisticated version of this for high school level? Example, create a technical manual for a software program or a video editing program, etc. What I like about these task frames is they give structure to tasks, but they also are open, allowing teachers to plug in content, skills, and even student choice when appropriate. So for example, in the first grade case, this little guy picked breakdancing where other first graders picked other things of interest to them. And so we can build in voice and choice into these task frames. So here's a resource that I highly recommend if you don't already know about this. An example is on the screen. This comes from the Literacy Design Collaborative, or LDC. You can Google ldc.org or just Google Literacy Design Collaborative, and you'll get to their website. Extraordinary resource of excellent task, they call them task templates, like this. These are developed in the U.S. in conjunction with Common Core standards for English language arts. But if you're familiar with Common Core, they are meant to be applied in science and social studies as well. Now, I know that some states either haven't adopted Common Core or are pulling back from them for political reasons. But I don't care about that. When you look at the task templates, you'll see that they are around important outcomes, regardless of what state or national body identifies them. So this is an example of a task frame used at the high school level. Let me show you 2 examples of its use. Here's the first, having kids examine a current issue that's being debated in lots of countries now. Here's the second example. Now this comes from a teacher of American literature and a unit on American humorists, but it uses the same task frame applied to literature. Now what I like about these task frames, and many teachers have told me they like, is that it gives structure to the task. It's aligned to important, authentic, and long-term outcomes, but gives you a place to plug in content. You could do this with different works of literature, different author styles, different views on an issue like regulation of drones, etc. Also, it gives opportunities when appropriate for student choice or teacher choice. If I were teaching a unit on humor, which I think would be great fun, maybe Mark Twain is part of our designated reading in the course syllabus, but Dave Barry probably isn't. So potentially you could open up the task that's on the screen and ask students to pick their favorite humorist and compare his or her humor with that of Twain. As in the previous example of the drones, you could potentially have kids pick an issue, research different points of view, come up with their own position, and develop their argument. This is rich with 21st century skills and application that are valued by people in and outside of school. But one more example of task frames that could be applicable in mathematics or science. Look at the task frame. And here are two examples. One from elementary level, where in this case, a second grade teacher had kids measure their heights every month. And over time, not only did they learn the skills of measurement and how to record numbers, they got into parts of numbers because we don't grow at 1-inch increments. They learned about charts and tables because we need some way of making sense of all the numbers we're gathering. And then toward the end of the year, they learned about graphic display of data, and they made growth charts. Tasks then involved the kids analyzing their growth charts and preparing a lesson that they could present to next year's second graders who are now in first grade, projecting their growth based on the data and analysis of their growth charts in second grade. Fast forward, high school level tasks built on the same template, very contemporary. Pardon my typo there, I just saw that in each. That should be out. But this is a real issue, and you're having kids investigate it, but you also potentially could give them options for how they would show or communicate their learning in different media or different forms. So let me do one more pause before we wrap up, and then I will take questions. Here are some design tools. Building tasks that involve application and explanation, using depth of knowledge to ensure that the tasks are at level 3, not low level, and use task frames such as those available from Literacy Design Collaborative as a structure for both building tasks, giving teacher and student choice in the tasks, and building tasks that recur across the grade. So we have the through lines of performance going from simpler to more sophisticated. So 2-minute pause before we wrap up. So we need to wrap up our scheduled webinar, but there are some questions that have come in. And I also want to share with you one other design tool that preceded the 2-minute pause, but it's one that Grant Wiggins and I have proposed and written about in our work on understanding by design. We propose that when you have the essential performance task in mind, when and if it's valuable, you can often enhance the task and provide greater authenticity in it by using a design tool that we call grasps. And the grasps frame is on the screen. And each of the letters in grasp gets at an aspect of task design.
Grasp is a frame that you can use to more specifically specify the elements of a task. And there's lots of information and examples in understanding by design. So I'm going to wrap up and then address a couple of questions for those of you who can hang on. I began the seminar or the webinar by talking about the focus on important outcomes of schooling that are the basis for performance tasks. I'd like to end by looking at the second purpose on the right side, which hopefully is evident, but I'd like to highlight a bit more particularly. I'm going to shift to the second of two slides. This is a construct that I found useful over the years that identifies factors that often are influential in student motivation and students' willingness to put forth effort on tasks or assignments. And the three categories involve, at the left side, task clarity. Students are more likely to put forth effort if they know the goal, if they know the task, if they know how their work will be evaluated or what good work looks like even, and if they are able to see models of good performance. So it's not a mystery what they're trying to achieve, or they may not understand the wording of a rubric, but they can see the difference between an excellent model and one that's not so good. My contention is that good performance tasks presented in these ways provide clarity about task and criteria. And when teachers show models of good performance, just like coaches show videos of excellent teams, kids understand what quality is and it becomes a learning target. The center column, learners are more likely to put forth effort if they see purpose, usefulness, and relevance in what they're being asked to learn. And to me, creating our curriculum around rich, authentic tasks helps students see relevance. And when we create contexts that are associated with their experiences or ones that relate to their culture, we can even bring in more kids, I believe, into the mix. And finally, the third column, a student's perception of their ability to be at least moderately successful is also a variable. I have seen cases where kids will shut down if they believe the task is so far beyond them that they can't do it. And sometimes it's better not to try or to act up to be distracting from your sense of inability or worry that you're going to be made to look foolish or stupid if you can't perform well. And this ties to the larger aspect of the kind of teaching and support needed to help kids do well on worthy, authentic tasks. And finally, the notion of celebrating not only achievement, but growth. Even for lower achieving students, special ed students, non-English speaking students, if we can over time trace their improvement and their growth and celebrate those things, I believe we keep more kids in the school game and have more ways for kids to be successful without lowering the bar of standards. So I'm going to wrap up with an interesting action research process that any and all of you could apply if you don't already. And then I'll take a few questions for people that can hang on. So my colleague Grant Wiggins developed an interesting survey that is administered to secondary school students, middle, junior, and senior high school. And they are typically administered at the end of the school year. Most of the survey are selected response format questions, but one of the more interesting ones to me is an open-ended prompt that's on the screen. Grant asked students to identify from the whole school year what was the most interesting task, project, assignment they had, to explain a little bit about it. Let me leave you with some very representative comments directly from students in their words. And so Grant summarized, literally from thousands of these responses, the generalization. And you can go to his blog post and read about this if you wish. Grant reminds us that the most interesting work and engaging work that students tell us is relevant, engages their thinking, links to the larger world, and to me, rich, authentic performance tasks have these qualities. stimulate and motivate kids to want to do good work, to be engaged with school, as well as giving us evidence of their capacity to apply their learning. So that is my story, and I'm sticking to it. Let me leave you with two resources that may be of interest. I have recently finished a blog series on performance tasks, and there are presently 7 blogs posted, including a lot of the ideas that are on in this webinar, but in more detail. So you can go to performancetask.com to access those blogs. And I've just finished a series of online modules that are not unlike this webinar, but a little more detail, that are available to you. So I'm going to wrap up with a few responses to a few questions, and then I'll turn it back to Adrienne for our concluding comments. Is that okay?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
So proceed, and I'll take over when you're done, Grant. I'm sorry, Jay.
Okay. I'm just scrolling through, and one question that Virginia asked was, she said, is a CEPA the same as a performance task? And the acronym CEPA, C-E-P-A, is typically used as meaning curriculum embedded performance assessment, a CEPA. And the short answer is yes, Virginia. I see them as the same. A number of you have referenced the relationship of performance tasks to project-based learning, and I wholeheartely agree. My daughter Maria taught at High Tech High in San Diego for 4 years, one of the preeminent project-based learning schools in the U.S. And I saw firsthand, both as an outsider but also as an insider through my daughter, how engaging and rich project-based learning can be. The main difference, I would say, is that typically performance tasks are shorter in scope, may or may not be interdisciplinary, whereas most projects are. Projects tend to be longer in scope and more comprehensive in scale. I'm scrolling through and not seeing any other questions. So let me turn it back to Adrienne and see if there are any questions that you have fielded. And otherwise, I thank everyone for attending, and I hope that you found this to be a useful hour or so.
Thank you so much, Grant. Oh, I'm sorry I keep doing that because people are writing about Grant.
I'm honored to be associated with him.
Yes. So let's see.
Well, actually, I do see questions at the end.
Yeah, there are a bunch of, let's see. What are the go-to resources for teachers developing performance skills and assessments? I think you probably covered that, Jay.
Well, I'll give you one other source, which I didn't put in the webinar, but I have been collecting on my website many resources that support the design of, or actually that have examples of good performance tasks and associated rubrics. And my website is just my name, jmctighe.com, C-O-M, and you'll find these under resources and websites. So I've tried to do a pretty thorough harvesting of great resources, and they're organized by subject areas as well as some are searchable databases like the Literacy Design Collaborative. So one great source is jmctighe.com, resources and websites.
That's great. Okay. So
Another
I'm just, yeah.
Another question that is often asked, and it's posed here, it's a good one. Address the fears that if we do these good tasks with students, how do we reconcile that with standardized tests that tend to address more specific content, often in a multiple choice format? This is an important question. I'll give you a short answer, but a well-considered one. First of all, my caution is don't conflate assessment format of standardized tests with cognitive level of demand. The pattern that we've seen in the U.S. over the last 15 years is noteworthy. State tests 10 to 15 years ago had a high percentage of items at level 1 and 2 of DOK, depth of knowledge. But over the last decade or so, many state assessments have been upgraded or revised, and a greater percentage of items are level 2 and even level 3. The consortium assessments from Park and Smarter Balance are also a higher percentage of items at level 3. And so I'm going to give you my short answer. I don't believe that we would lose performance on standardized tests. We would lose achievement scores or have them drop if students are engaged in more performance tasks. On the contrary, I contend that the best prep for standardized tests is not multiple choice test prep at low levels, but rather teaching for understanding and transfer and giving kids lots of opportunities to apply their learning. That if they understand the content being tested, they will do better than kids who simply are rote learning their way to higher scores, because that doesn't happen. The most widely missed items on state or national tests, and you check this out in your state if you don't believe me, the most widely missed items are items that require some degree of inference, interpretation, and reading. They are multi-step problems in mathematics. They require reasoning. And if there are other subject areas, they involve higher order thinking, not just recall. Again, don't let the format of multiple choice delude you into thinking they're all low level. They're not. So thanks for the question. That was my soapbox answer.
Great. And I agree. And I think that if we work with our students and prepare them with performance tasks, then they've already learned the most challenging things and should be able to do well on most of the things that they're presented with.
Agreed.
So, Jay, I want to thank you so much for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. It's been fantastic, hugely helpful. The comments that people have left have been extremely complimentary, and I think that people got a lot out of this. So a million thanks.
I thank you and Triumph Learning for sponsoring the webinar and for everyone in attendance.
Great. And I'm just going to end with a couple of housekeeping details. You'll get your certificate tomorrow for those of you that were here full time or most of the time. If you want to, if you missed a lot of this, it will be in the Assessment for Learning community shortly, and you'll be able to watch the recording, read the transcript, and also the chat on the side, which was very interesting. People were really on target and on task, sharing resources too. And if you take the quiz after watching, you will be able to get your CE certificate that way. Yay, Triumph and Coach Products. We're going to send you out a discount coupon tomorrow as a thank you for attending. And again, we urge you to join the Assessment for Learning community online on EdWeb. So with no further ado, we will be signing off, and we greatly appreciate your having been here. Thanks a million, everybody.